On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late, it was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo. And so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious. And so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these 2 eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the 2 eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief, and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash. They turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room, and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with 2 functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you. But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream, and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911, and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion, and then coming back in, hearing the sound, and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go. And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police. And so the friend said, okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police. And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house. And she walked over to the sink and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window. And there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police. But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so, acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point, and her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead, and Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. It's no secret that a lot of the stories I've covered over the years are about real people who have been victims of just unspeakable violence. And so that's why, back in April of 2022, we decided to launch the Mr. Ballen Foundation, which was established to honor and support victims of violent crime and their families. And so now, over 2 years later, I'm happy to report that, with your help, because none of this would be possible without all of you, we have been able to give $1.4 million to this group of people, to these victims and their families, who are often overlooked after the news story about whatever happened to them fades. All donations that are made to the Mr. Ballen Foundation, literally 100% of them, go out the door to the cause. Meaning if you give $10, that $10 is going to the victims, it's going to their families. This is one of the very rare nonprofits that can actually say that. If you're interested in joining the Mr. Ballen Foundation community and contributing to this effort, all you have to do is go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Donate. Again, just go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Donate. Thank you again to all our donors, our listeners, viewers, all the people that made this possible. We are genuinely changing the world. Thank you so much, and now back to the story. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least 2 gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. I mean, there were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing, and Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. I mean, there were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go, she must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her, or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication, but after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog, to clear her head, and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her, and then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state, and so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her, but again, it's just her reflection, and so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person and then didn't see anybody, and then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers, and then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind. Before I became a professional, strange, dark, and mysterious storyteller, I served in the military. And during my time in the military, I had some pretty wild experiences. But what I remember most about my time in service was not my own stories, but rather the stories I heard from other service members. Keep in mind, service members are sent to some of the most isolated and treacherous places in the world that very few people go to. And so some of the stories that come out of those places are totally creepy and weird. And even more than that, a lot of these stories sort of stay in-house. They stay in the military just because it's kind of a cultural thing. People don't necessarily want to go out and tell the world about the totally unsettling and inexplicable thing they saw while they were deployed. It's like people might think they were crazy. But there's lots of stories like that. And so if hearing some of those crazy military stories appeals to you, well, boy, do I have a podcast for you. It's called Wartime Stories, and it's hosted by Luke Lamanna, who himself is a veteran. He was a reconnaissance Marine, which I can tell you is kind of a big deal. And so because he has access and placement, he's been able to extract some of these stories from the military, and he shares them on the show. And if you wanted to kind of generalize the types of stories you're going to hear on this podcast, it's like the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield and beyond. The Wartime Stories podcast is free, and it's available on any podcast platform. So all you have to do is, go to your favorite platform and look up Wartime Stories, or you can search for Ballin Studios because it's produced under Ballin Studios. You click on the show, give it a follow, and boom, you can start your binge. New episodes drop every Monday, so if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, well, you got yourself a brand new weekly show. Him goofing around with his 3 kids because he adored his kids. They were the most important thing to him by far. But despite having this very cheerful outward presence on social media, privately, Daniel was dealt yet another very difficult blow in 2019 when his marriage to Bogdana, his second wife, fell apart. And so once again, Daniel was all alone. His social media posts around the time of the second divorce remained positive and very optimistic for the most part, but anytime you saw an image of Daniel actually facing the camera, you could just see a distinct sadness in his eyes. But just as quickly as it seemed like once again Daniel's life was just going to crumble, something truly amazing happened for Daniel. Daniel's first ex-wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 kids decided to leave Alaska and come back to Nevada and resettle in Las Vegas. This was not because Elizabeth wanted to rekindle with Daniel. It was just because she and the kids liked living in Las Vegas and wanted to come back. And as soon as they were back, Daniel suddenly got to see his kids all the time. He was so excited and so happy. In fact, by late 2020, Daniel's youngest daughter, Sierra, who was 16, she had basically just moved in with Daniel, even though legally speaking, she was not supposed to be doing that. And her mom, Elizabeth, was totally unhappy about it. But regardless, that was just how it was. She was living with Daniel. In August of that year, so around the time that Sierra had basically moved back in with Daniel, Daniel decided to take his ex-wife, Elizabeth, back to court to see if he could get custody of Sierra, because Sierra was the only minor of their 3 children. She was still 16, and at that point, Sierra was already living with him. During the recorded video sessions between Daniel, Elizabeth, and the judge, Daniel would tell the judge that life in Elizabeth's home was totally toxic and not good for his children, and certainly not good for Sierra. Daniel would explain to the judge that Sierra was really struggling with some mental health issues, and what she needed right now was professional therapy, something he had already enrolled her in since she had moved back in with him. Daniel also presented to the judge a letter that he said Sierra wrote that basically backed up the idea that she is better off living with her father. Elizabeth would generally respond to all of these things that Daniel was saying by saying Daniel was a liar and that he was not fit to be a parent, and that letter that he claims Sierra wrote doesn't sound like her, insinuating that, the letter was forged. The judge, who at regular intervals would get very frustrated with both Daniel and Elizabeth, finally would just say, look, you got all sorts of issues between the two of you, and it's creating a horrible environment for your kids. And if you don't find a way to come to some sort of compromise, the people that are going to suffer are your kids, specifically Sierra. Finally, in early 2021, when Daniel and Elizabeth still had not come to terms, the judge just ordered that Daniel return Sierra to her mother's residence, because legally speaking, Sierra was supposed to be in her mother's care. And so begrudgingly, Daniel would take Sierra and he would bring her back to her mother's house, and he would say, okay, go see your mother, and then he would drive off. But later that night, Sierra would sneak out of her mother's house and just run back to be with her dad. Needless to say, Daniel was not unhappy about that turn of events. The custody battle over Sierra continued to rage for the next several months, with Sierra opting to still remain at her father's place despite the court order, despite her mother pleading with her to come home. And then in April of 2021, something very odd happened. On the morning of April 8th, several $100s was withdrawn from Daniel's bank account from a few different ATMs around Las Vegas. This particular bank account was shared between Daniel and his second ex-wife, Bogdana. They just hadn't gotten around to relinquishing control to one or the other. And so these particular withdrawals were kind of uncharacteristic for Daniel or for Bogdana, and so they were flagged as potentially fraudulent, and so the bank sent notifications to both Daniel and Bogdana saying as much. And so Bogdana, she gets the messages that there's been these potentially fraudulent charges. She knows it wasn't her, and so she calls Daniel, but Daniel doesn't pick up, and so she texts Daniel. But again, silence from Daniel. Thinking this was a little bit odd, Bogdana reached out to Daniel's mother, Christine, knowing that Daniel and his mom spoke nearly every day. And so she filled the mother in about what was going on. And after getting all the information from Bogdana, Christine would try calling and texting Daniel, but still got nothing. And so she reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. And so she calls Sierra. Sierra doesn't pick up. She texts Sierra asking to speak to Daniel, and Sierra doesn't get back right away, but eventually she responds to Christine, and the response just said, his phone has been acting up, but he's okay. It should be fixed by tomorrow night. No worries. Now, Christine was relieved to read that her son and her granddaughter were just fine, but at the same time, there was just something odd about the fact that she could not get in touch with her son, and that Sierra was kind of acting a little bit cagey, not answering her phone, which was unlike her, and then sending a message that didn't quite sound like her. But either way, Christine just let it go and figured she would be in touch with her son over the next 24 hours. But the next day, by 10 a.m., when Christine and Bogdana had not heard or seen Daniel, Christine again reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. She called her, but she didn't pick up. And so she texted Sierra, this time demanding that she put her father on the phone. But Sierra did not put her father on the phone. Instead, after a few minutes, Christine just got another text message that said something to the effect of, my dad's in the shower, so he can't talk right now. Christine, at this point, it was like her radar was up, and she knew there was a real problem. She didn't know what it was, but there was a problem, and someone needed to go over to Daniel's house and make sure he and Sierra were okay. And so Christine contacted a woman named Peggy Newman, who was Daniel's landlord and a close friend of Daniel. And she asked Peggy, would you mind going and doing a welfare check at Daniel's house? And Peggy would say, of course, no problem, but I won't be able to get over there for at least several hours. So Christine said, no problem. But as soon as she hung up, Christine just was so anxious, waiting to find out what was going on with her son, that at 1:46 p.m., when still Peggy was out running errands and had not done the welfare check yet, Christine just called the police and asked them to do a welfare check.
Yeah, hi, I need a welfare check. I don't know if
on who are we doing a welfare check?
For my son. He's been missing for 2 days. His work's called. His family's called, I've called, his ex-wife's called, and there's nobody answering the phone, and there's nothing. Nobody can get a hold of him, and then his work called, and they can't get a hold of him, and it's really, he just doesn't act like this.
But as it would happen, just a few minutes after Christine placed that 911 call, Peggy Newman and a friend of hers actually arrived at Daniel's residence ahead of the police. And so when they got there, they hopped out of their car, they walked up to the front door, and as they're knocking on the front door, they look over into the driveway and they see Daniel's car, which was a blue Nissan Altima, is not there. And so they're knocking, they're seeing the car's not there, it's totally silent in the house. And so Peggy, she reaches down and she tries the doorknob and she finds it's unlocked. And so she twists the knob, she opens the door, and she and her friend step inside. Just minutes later, Peggy and her friend would come running out of the house, and Peggy would call 911 because the police weren't there yet, and she would frantically try to describe to the dispatcher what she had just seen. 24 hours earlier, a man and a woman were spotted on surveillance camera withdrawing cash from several Las Vegas ATMs using Daniel's debit card. Those were the withdrawals that had been flagged as fraudulent and tipped Bogdana off that something could be wrong here. After those withdrawals, the man and the woman were spotted again on camera going into a Las Vegas supermarket called Winco, and inside they would purchase a few items using Daniel's debit card, and then they would leave and they would head to a Las Vegas Home Depot, where once again they'd be caught on camera purchasing a few items using Daniel's debit card. After these purchases, the man and the woman would make their way to Daniel's residence, where they would spend the night. The following morning, Daniel's blue Nissan Altima car was spotted leaving Las Vegas at around 10:20 in the morning. That was about 3.5 hours before Peggy Newman and her friend went into Daniel's residence and then quickly turned around and ran out and called 911. When police finally did arrive at Daniel's residence on April 9th, and they pulled up and they saw Peggy Newman and her friend totally ashen-faced and pacing on the sidewalk, the police would get out, they would talk to those two, they would go inside of Daniel's residence, and they would see the horrible thing that Peggy and her friend had also seen. But the police could not make sense of what they were seeing. It really just did not add up. Then, 4 days later, on April 13th, police in Salt Lake City, Utah, just happened to find the man and the woman that were seen on camera on April 8th using Daniel's debit card and going to the Winco and the Home Depot. The police, they just happened to find these people on a bus in Salt Lake City. And after going through the man and the woman's belongings, including their phones, the police would discover a video that these two had taken of themselves in the last couple of days that explained what was inside of Daniel's house.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. Day three after murdering somebody.
Wow! Don't put that on camera.
It was worth it.
The young man and the young woman you just saw joking on camera about murdering someone were 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero and his girlfriend, 16-year-old Sierra Halseth, Daniel's youngest daughter. Allegedly, on the morning of April 8th, after Aaron and Sierra had pulled all that money out of all those different ATMs, they had gone to the Winco and purchased disposable gloves and bleach and drop cloths, and they had gone to the Home Depot and purchased a circular saw and saw saw blades and lighter fluid. And then they headed for Daniel's house. It's not been made public what actually occurred inside of Daniel's residence, but we can make a few assumptions. Daniel adored his children. There was no act there. He truly loved his children. And so it would never cross his mind that one of his children or one of their significant others would ever want to hurt him. And so when Sierra and Aaron went inside of Daniel's house, it would have been extremely easy to sneak up on Daniel or just kind of catch him off guard because he's not looking to put up a fight. He thinks he's around people that love him and respect him because he loves and respects them. But however the young couple did it, they would inflict up to 70 stab wounds in Daniel's body, most of which were in the back of his head. And then at some point during this vicious attack, they stuffed Daniel into a sleeping bag, and right in the middle of the living room of his house, they doused him in lighter fluid and lit him on fire. It's unclear what exactly killed Daniel or for how long he was actually conscious and aware of what was happening before he died, but it's very possible that Daniel had at least a small moment in time where he recognized his beloved little angel, Sierra, was actively trying to kill him. After Daniel was either dead or incapacitated, the young couple tossed their pocket knives into the sink, and then they retrieved their circular saw as well as a chainsaw and began attempting to dismember Daniel's body. But they were unable to do it, and so they just kind of set the saws down in the middle of Daniel's home with bits of Daniel stuck on the grooves of the saw. At that point, Aaron and Sierra attempted to destroy evidence inside of the house by scrubbing everything down with bleach, but it was totally ineffective. And so at that point, the couple decided they would just burn the entire house down, and that would destroy all the evidence. And so around the time that Christine texted Sierra and demanded to speak to Daniel, and Sierra wrote back, "Oh, he's in the shower, he can't talk to you right now," that was probably around the time that Sierra and Aaron were actively trying to burn the house down. But the fire they set was just not very big, and it kind of smoldered out. And so they would just kind of leave all of the evidence all over Daniel's house, and they would leave Daniel's destroyed and burned body kind of propped up against the door leading into the garage. And they would just leave the house, hop in Daniel's blue Nissan Altima, and at around 10:20 in the morning, they would leave Las Vegas. The only reason police were able to apprehend Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City a few days later was because the couple had made their way to Salt Lake City and hopped on a bus, and Aaron had not paid the fare. He had just snuck onto the bus. And so at some point, the transit authority had come through the bus, and they were asking people to show their tickets, and Aaron didn't have one. And so when they discovered this, they asked for his name, and when they entered his name into their system, it popped up that the Las Vegas PD were actively searching for him. While only Sierra knows why she turned on the one man who would forever love her and would forever support her, what we do know is around the time that Daniel and Elizabeth had gone back to court and they were having those virtual meetings with the judge to decide who was going to have custody over Sierra, Sierra had begun dating Aaron, and she had fallen totally in love with him, and it seemed very much like Aaron had totally fallen in love with her. And somehow Daniel caught wind of the fact that Aaron and Sierra were planning to run away secretly and go move to Los Angeles. And so when Daniel heard this, he told his ex-wife Elizabeth, and then they would go and talk to Aaron's parents, and they would tell them about this plan to run away. And both sets of parents talked and decided it was in both child's best interest if they stopped seeing each other. And so starting in early 2021, the parents forbade their child from seeing each other, and that was it. But even though all the parents were involved in this decision, because Sierra was at the time living with Daniel, it seemed like she focused her rage about this decision on Daniel, because he was the one kind of enforcing the rule. And so it's believed in April of that year, Sierra decided she would just have to kill her father in order to get her boyfriend back. In Daniel's obituary, his family very conspicuously left Sierra out, saying that Daniel was survived by 2 loving children, not 3. His family has also come out and publicly stated that they hope Sierra and her boyfriend are given the harshest penalty allowable by law. Despite the existence of this confession video that Aaron and Sierra took of themselves talking about murdering Daniel, they have pled not guilty and are currently awaiting trial. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please move in to the room directly above the like buttons apartment and immediately begin hosting tap dancing classes in your apartment. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast just called Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we upload never before heard stories that are total podcast exclusives on Monday mornings. And on Thursday mornings, we re-upload YouTube audio that has been remastered. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, basically anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes